Greetings mortals, it is I, Yibagoon. Welcome to Age of Mythology Retold and my video series for learning how to trigger in Retold. This series I will teach you from the stages of utter beginner where you don't know what a trigger is to how to create powerful custom scenarios using triggers. First of all, let's jump straight into the scenario editor. To begin, we want to select either the triggers icon up here or the triggers menu and the triggers icon. From there, the trigger editor interface will appear in front of you. First question, what is a trigger? Think of it as a statement where if something happens, then an effect happens. In order to create one, we're going to have to press the new trigger button. You can see quite a change. We've first of all got our new trigger here, which is named trigger 0. Something's appeared in the condition box and something's appeared in the effects box. We've also got a tick in the active box here. Let me explain what all of these mean. If your trigger is active, that means it will run. If you uncheck it, it means your trigger won't run unless you tell it to with another trigger. Loop means that once your trigger finishes, as long as the condition is met or the condition keeps happening, the effects will keep happening. Run immediately means that your trigger runs before the very first frame of the game. You'd only usually need to check this box if it's the very first trigger of your map, otherwise there's not much point. The priority slider below is thinking about how much the game cares about being strict to your condition. For example, every trigger is set to high and that should be default for what you're aiming to. There are very few reasons why you would want this to not be high. Now you can see we've got some radio buttons here. If we press conditions, we come into the conditions tab. I'm going to leave this one as it is for now and come back to it later. If we press the effect button, we come into the effect tab. Again, from these tabs we can delete, we can insert new effects, we can copy effects, and we can change the order of our effects by moving them up and down. The very first one we come to is trigger activate. If you click this arrow here, behold the list of all the possible trigger effects you can have in Age of Mythology Retold. It's quite an extensive list and you can accomplish quite a lot with these commands. If you wanted a specific one, for example God Power, you could type God Power into this box and then the drop down would only feature effects that are relevant to what you've searched. So for example, I'll select this one, God Power Grant to Player. You note this text is still in the box. If I want to go for another trigger, that text disappears and then I can select from the entire list again. If you want to select from the entire list, you just delete what you've put here and then you can search the entire list. So this effect will grant a God Power to Player 1. I'm going to ask it to grant Carnivora God Power with one use. That's it, we've made a very basic trigger. If we go to Scenario Playtest Scenario, we can now see what this trigger actually does. Now you can see we've got our standard God Power from Zeus, and we've also got the Carnivora God Power as per our trigger. Congratulations, you've just made your first trigger. Of course, we're going to get a lot more complicated than this, and we're going to do a lot more things. If we go back to the Conditions tab, again, similar, there's a drop down, there's a type filter, there's a long list of conditions which you can use for your trigger. I'm now going to use the timer and set this to 1 second, and this will show you the importance of the priority. So this trigger should grant the God Power after 1 second has passed. If we test the scenario again, we see that nothing happens and then at 1 second the Carnivora is granted. If I change the priority slider to go all the way down to the bottom, it means the game doesn't really care too much about the condition. And you'll see that after 1 second, we don't get our power. The game takes its time, not really caring, and then eventually we do get our Carnivora God Power 6 seconds on low priority. Of course, it's going to change dependent on map and how many triggers you've got, but there's really no reason to have anything other than high priority here. If we loop our trigger, what happens is, again, we get the God Power granted at the first second. but every other second we get another and another and another God power, and that will keep on running. If I deactivate my trigger, then nothing will happen, even if it's looped, because it's not active, so it won't actually work. As I said, that's your basic trigger. You can name your triggers by typing in and pressing enter, and I'd recommend doing this if you've got a big scenario with lots of triggers, because it's easy to keep track of them. In Retold, what you can also do is write a note. So this is a brief description, so I could say I grant P1 a God power in there, just to explain what it does, because if you have lots of triggers, it's sometimes quite nice to see what happens, although you will get an overview of your conditions and your first effects. Sometimes this note here is quite useful. If I now make this trigger inactive, as I've said before, it won't run. If I do another trigger with a timer of 1 second again, you'll see the very first one is trigger activate. This is how we activate triggers that are inactive by default. So what's going to happen here? After 1 second, the trigger will fire to grant the carnivora. So let's see this in action. You can see that once the trigger is linked, a list appears in the linked trigger box underneath here. So, in game, our carnivora, it was granted at 2 seconds. How come? So what happened here was we waited 1 second for the trigger 1 to tell this to activate, and then we waited another second because the condition here is 1 second. If I set it to always, it would be granted at 1 second. If you're making a complex scenario with lots of triggers, you can arrange your triggers in groups. To do this, you go to the Triggers Group Editor, press Insert, and give your group a name, and then you can move triggers into it. So for example, if I go to Ungrouped, where I store my triggers, you'll see that I've got my Grant Carnivora and my trigger 1 there. If I press this radio button for triggers and select Starting Group, I can move them between groups. What this looks like on the trigger interface is trigger 1 is now ungrouped. If I press this drop down here and go to Starting Group, that's where I find my Grant Carnivora. If I press New Trigger in here, it creates in the group that hosts it. You can delete, you can also duplicate, so this copies the trigger exactly along with all the effects as you have specified. You can move up and down for ease of display, and you can delete. These also apply to conditions, and they also apply to effects. What a trigger is it's really excess code. The game gives you the trigger interface in order for you to essentially code without writing. What it's possible to do now in Retold is import an excess script directly into the scenario. That's way beyond the scope of what we're doing here. Just letting you know about this, because sometimes you might want to open a scenario and see what triggers someone's put and only find there are no triggers and there's something in here if they've written the code manually. If we go back to our triggers and activate it, we can also talk about trigger errors. AoM Mythology Retold is really good because it will tell you if you have an error. I'm going to put an invalid symbol in here, so I'm going to say £1 uses. That doesn't make sense because we want a whole number, not a currency in there. If I test the scenario, what you'll now find is, as soon as the scenario starts, we get a trigger error dialog telling us something is wrong. If you navigate to the AoM Mythology Retold directory and look at the trigger folder, you'll find a file called trigtemp.xs. Line 27 is where the error occurs, so if you open up that file, it might give you an idea of what you're doing wrong. Sometimes it will give you a helpful hint in this error message to explain what you're doing wrong. It was a big ask from our original AoM Mythology players, so I'm really pleased that the devs put this feature in here. You'll see that normally it's a trigger lock, so nothing happens, but once you have this error, you can a bit easily pinpoint what's going on and what's wrong with your trigger, so you can change it into something that's actually working and get rid of the error. That's all I want to tell you in this video. It's a very basic introduction into what a trigger is. Throughout this series I'll be explaining different triggers, different effects and different ways of doing things. Please leave a comment if you've got something in particular you'd like to see, but I look forward to you joining me on this journey. Until next time.